Hi there. I hope everyone's staying safe and warm here before the ice apocalypse that's supposed to hit Alabama tonight. This is the first and most important lecture of the cybersecurity module. Now, as most of you know, this is what I do in my day job, as they say. I am the director of cybersecurity operations for information security at UAB Medicine. We are the largest employer in the state of Alabama, as I've said in other lectures. We've probably got over 100,000 endpoints, about 36 to 32,000 employees, depending on how you count them. It's a big job, and this is one of those things that I find very exciting. The job itself doesn't really stress me out, but we're not here to talk about my job. We're here to talk about the anatomy of a cyber attack. This lecture should dovetail nicely, and the materials within this lecture should connect very nicely with what you learned in Foundations for Enterprise Technology. And when you're going to see these various ways in which attacks occur, you're going to, somewhere along the line, hopefully a light bulb will go on and go, oh, we learned about that in the last module. All right. That said, I do want to introduce some material that's actually not in the slide deck. And I may upload a piece of this later. It comes from a CrowdStrike tabletop exercise that we did for the executives at UAB Medicine. And one of the things that they did very well was sort of introduce the idea of third-party malicious actors and criminal enterprises in the cybersecurity world, and help people to sort of understand that this is not the cyber attack enterprise of even 5 or 6 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. From the movies, we all sort of think of hackers as, some script guy that's in his mom's basement or his grandma's basement, right? And he's tapping away, trying to get into the NSA system, and that's not how cybersecurity attacks work at all. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen from time to time, but the efficacy or the effectiveness of an attack like that is almost zero, just so you know. All right, so that has been a significant change. Most of the cyber attacks and the criminal enterprises that sometimes coordinate with each other, sometimes are part of what we call a nation state criminal enterprise. That is, for example, the Russians and the Chinese and North Koreans actually fund the criminals that do most of the cyber attacking. And these are the, China, North Korea, Russia are still today the #1 outsourcer of malicious threat actors. And some of the services we subscribe to actually keep track of these guys, and I'll talk more about that later. But what I did want to tell you is, as opposed to some guy trying to hack into a database from somewhere, most cyber attacks are actually automated. That's the first most important piece. The second most important piece is that not only is it automated, but it used to be threat actors would go after high profile potential victims. That's not the case anymore either. As it relates to malware, anybody's good enough. And because it's automated and it's run by what we call bot farms, which are delivered through social media, porn sites, and other malicious sites, these automated attacks are happening everywhere. There's an old adage, when I say old, it's a few years old, that basically says if you connect your computer to the internet without some form of protection, it will be compromised within about 30 seconds. And I'd say that's probably true. In addition to the bot farms, what these malicious threat actors do is they collect names, resources, personal information, and they sell it. And not only did they sell it, but they sell their software as a service. You today could go out to a threat actor's website, pay a fee, and with your fee, you would have the ability to start spamming organizations with, phishing emails and various types of threats. And if I could show you how that works in real time, I've been trying to think about showing it to you, and I may get one member of my team to sort of record a session just to show how fast it is. So the two big changes are most attacks are automated. AI has made this even worse, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. And most of the software from which this is delivered is actually stuff that somebody just bought. They bought it off the internet, and they're not responsible for it. They're not sitting there hacking. They set it up on their computer, they push a button, and away it goes. And then it reports back to them who they've compromised. And it's very interesting, and it's very effective. And the reason it works that way, quite frankly, is it's super effective and it's lucrative, and they make tons of money doing it. All right, so those are the things I wanted to introduce to you as we started this module. All right, let's talk about how malicious threat actors gain access, big picture. That's what this diagram is from or demonstrates. So you have sold or leveraged access. That means somebody went out there and bought your name, your email address, your username and password. And by the way, if you want to know if your credentials have been compromised in one of these security hacks, LinkedIn or Chase or one of the other big ones, all you have to do is go out to a website that says iampwned.com, Pwned, and you can look yourself up, and you're probably out there. Most of us are, which is why it's such an important thing to not only change your password regularly, but to increase the length of your password. These 6 and 8 character passwords that people use are completely ineffective against threat actors. And the one saving grace that we have in most organizations is what we call MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. That's when you log in and then you're given it's the old question and challenge and answer, which is, hey, fill in this blank or push this button or say what number's on this screen on a separate technology device. That's called MFA. What we use at Sanford is Duo. Lots of other places use the Azure Authenticator, and there's a bunch of other tools out there, but those are the two biggest ones. All right, so somewhere out there is some bad guy that's got our information, and they sold it to somebody who wants to make money off of it. You see this slide where it says initial access broker. That is the person who's the entity that's delivering the software in whatever form it appears. Now, there are two main ways, and we're going to see this in another slide, that people get compromised. But this is why I want you to look at the Verizon report first. So let's walk through this real quick. On the top side of the slide, what you have is valid credentials, stolen or guessed. Now, the thing about guessing passwords is, for short passwords, it could be guessed if the person knows you, they've done some spear phishing, they've collected more information. We put way too much personal information online, and people can deduce. But what mostly happens is what we call brute force, and a brute force attack typically means you have, let's say you used to use 6-character passwords and now you use 8-character passwords. But what you did was you reused your old password for the first 6 characters. That is very likely known to attackers, and that means all they have to do is crack 2 characters, which takes less than 3 seconds, just so you know. All right, so that's one way. If you look at the top side, what they're trying to do is they're scanning devices constantly, and what they're looking for is misconfigured servers or exploits. Now, what they mean by that are CVEs. I'm not going to explain that now because I'm going to explain it later. Otherwise, this lecture is going to get way too long. So they're looking for some exploit on what's called a perimeter device from our Foundations for Enterprise Technology. That's what we call the DMZ. That is everything that's in the zone between the organization and the outside world. Okay, now let's look at the bottom. Exploit or misconfigurations, phishing attacks. So once you read the DBR report, what you're going to see is the number one way in which threat actors get into an organization is by stolen credentials. Primarily, and when I say stolen, what I mean is more often than not, people just give up their credentials. And I can talk about this forever. You can design a phishing email that is very easy to get people to just respond to it and type in their username and their password. And look, here's the thing. There isn't a legitimate IT organization in the world that asks for your username and password. It doesn't exist. So if it comes in a phishing attack or a link, then you know you are being phished. So phishes and people are still the weakest link. I can't emphasize that enough. And we're going to talk more about that in the human component. Obviously, once somebody gives up their credentials, they can deposit malware. We'll talk a little bit about what malware is, what it isn't, and how it typically works later on. And then they just infect the organization and eventually try to get to what we call Active Directory or LDAP or whatever source holds our core security credentials. Once they have that, they can lock down the entire organization, and you've all seen this in the news. Once that happens, the organization is screwed. There's no other way to put it. It ain't great. All right, let's keep going. All right, we're going to move through a couple of these really quickly. Okay, almost every failure begins with a small but usually sophisticated technical breakthrough. Attackers typically gain entry through phishing emails, stolen credentials, unpatched vulnerabilities, or exposed services. From the NIST cybersecurity framework perspective, this phase maps primarily to the identity and protect functions. We're going to talk more about NIST and the NIST wheel. That's going to be one of the lectures. It's going to be short, but I want to make sure everybody understands. And the key leadership insight here is most organizations don't lose control because attackers are advanced. It's just that security controls are inconsistently applied, typically, and poorly governed. And what I mean by that is, if your people are trained up and they can identify a phishing attack, awesome. If you have workstations that aren't patched on a regular basis, or servers, or firewalls that don't have the proper ACLs, what we call access control lists, on them, and I've seen that so often. People buy a firewall, they plug it in, they get all the network attached to it, and they think the firewall has some innate ability to stop bad guys, and it doesn't. It has to be configured. All right, misconfigurations are one of the major reasons behind high-profile cybersecurity attacks. All right, moving on. Once a cybersecurity breach has happened, once an attacker gains a foothold, what they try to do is reconnaissance, but they try to fly underneath the radar. So a lot of times, what ends up happening is threat actors, and I've seen this working with another organization that we were helping out, the threat actor had been in their network for months, but they never knew it because they didn't have enough cybersecurity material deployed. They didn't have the right patching deployed. They didn't have any way to identify somebody kind of moving around their network. So what they do is they get in these networks and they basically live off the land. In other words, they look like an authenticated user. They don't try to do a lot of what we would call noisy things. And then they scan the network internally to identify all the resources. They locate, as it said, open ports and access points. Those are on those network switches. Remember from the Foundations for Enterprise Technology? Network switching, right? Commodity switching is all over the place. And those VLANs are separating parts of the network, but if they have open ports, an attacker can get through there. Then what they do is they look to see what services are running on the reports. This is all about reconnaissance. Now I want you to remember, they haven't done anything yet. All they're doing is trying to figure out where the crown jewels are at. By the way, this can happen very, very quickly in a poorly governed network, or in a better one, it can take time. And there are ways to defend against it. We'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, moving on. Once inside the environment, the attackers always slow down. They shift their focus from access to understanding. It's always about who's out there, right? They look at all the systems. They look at all the access points. They look at all the switches to see what's open. And then what they do is they start looking at where the privileges lie with other individuals. So one of the things that they're always trying to do at some level is escalate their permissions to some kind of local administrator. And one of the ways we defend against that at UAB Medicine is we have alerts because of the way we configure our machines and our user roles. If somebody is elevated to a local administrator, an alert fires off, and we immediately know who it is and why it is. And if they don't match our list of people who've been given local administrator authority, then we just lock the machine up. And so we see that. So this is an area in which, when we talk about reconnaissance and foothold, that sometimes these dwell times can go days, weeks, months, sometimes even a year. One of the biggest attacks that happened about 4 years ago was through solar winds, and it's what's called a supply chain attack. So what SolarWinds does is they have devices that monitor your network for you. And it'll tell you when devices are down, it'll tell you when something needs a patch, it'll tell you when something's running slowly. SolarWinds is a pretty great product, and as a CIO, I used it in a lot of places. But long after I left my CIO position, what had happened was a malicious threat actor found a way into the SolarWinds developer area, and that probably through a phishing email, or somebody either gave up their credentials or they left something unsecured, because that's what happened with Optum. And I'll talk about Optum because it's so ridiculous how bad that was, and it was just because somebody wasn't paying attention. But going back to SolarWinds, so remember what I said SolarWinds does? It maps out your network and tells you where everything is at. Well, they were dwelling for 2 years at the SolarWinds development, and they were injecting code into the updates for SolarWinds. So one of the benefits of the SolarWinds device is SolarWinds, the company, would manage it for you and update it for you, in other words. And look, for small IT departments, that's great. But unbeknownst to all these people, and it was thousands of companies, threat actors had been injecting code into the SolarWinds console, unbeknownst to SolarWinds. And every time a device updated itself, it was delivering all that information back to the threat actors on thousands. In fact, they were so successful in their malware exploitation, they did it all on a single day. They had all these organizations. They made so much money, and there was so much heat, they immediately dissolved their organization and fled into the hinterlands, never to be found again. I think one of them was arrested later, but I'm sure because it was a nation state, it was because they probably just made somebody mad. So that's what they're doing in reconnaissance. They're looking for what's out there. And I'll tell you a little trick that we use at UAB Medicine that helps us identify if somebody's moving around the network. So like most organizations, we are huge. We don't have clear lines of sight, what we call east-west. That's internal traffic. North-south traffic is what we call you out to the internet. Okay? All right. So that said, we have honeypots, which we'll talk about that. What a honeypot is it's an artificial server, workstation, document, something out there that a threat actor might look at and say, oh, that looks juicy, and go touch it when they're doing their reconnaissance. We intentionally leave them unprotected, and we have background code running on them, which is invisible to anybody but us. No one knows where they are but us. Nobody knows what VLANs they exist in but us, etc. You get the picture. We don't even let our infrastructure people know where they're at intentionally. But if somebody touches one, we immediately get an alert that tells us somebody is doing reconnaissance on the network. So we've had test reconnaissance when we do what we call a purple team exercise, and we've had the threat actors, they're ethical hackers, start running through our network and go, oh, I got you now, and they touched what looked like a server that didn't have any authentication attached to it. We immediately knew where they were and locked them down. Anyway, good times. All right, let's keep going. All right, so basically this slide is just depicting what I'm just talking about. They prefer to get in the infrastructure, which would be the server side, and from there, they map out the network. They map out, I'm sorry, excuse me. They map out what roles are on those servers, what's the highest level of administrative access, and then they try to compromise it. They try to spread the compromise. And this is what modern attackers do. They increasingly avoid traditional malware, which just immediately deploys in the environment. This is what's called living off the land. Attackers try to blend into normal administrative activity using PowerShell. So, and they use legitimate services to look at what's out there on the network. You know, they're using native tools. They're trying to escalate credentials, and they really don't use malware or negative or destructive software until they're ready to make a move. All right, let's talk about data exfiltration. So this is one of the pieces. So I don't want you to get the idea that all cyber attacks are the same. They're not, but they do fall into categories. And the general means of compromise is almost always somebody or a misconfigured or a system that's not patched. It's almost always. But we talked about living off the land. So when a cyber attacker is ready to get paid, they're going to do two things. They're going to, get into a data structure. And that's what they're trying to do. If they have command and control of the network behind the scenes, they're going to try to get sensitive data, and they're going to try to move it out to their cloud servers somewhere. Okay, this is what's called a C2 callback, and we see a lot of this behavior in our network when people visit certain sites. But because we have devices that are set up to stop C2 callbacks immediately, the actual attack is blocked before it ever gets off the ground. And the threat actors know that. So data exfiltration is the part of the attack where they're deploying malware, but they're not activating it. And then they're getting sensitive data, and they're pulling it off the system. And this is what you typically see in the news. I'm sitting here thinking about one that we had several years ago where it was actually one of the network guys told us. They said, look, there's an awful lot of data moving out of the firewall at such and such location. So we blocked the port so it would stop, and went to find the person. I'm not going to tell you what we found, but it wasn't great, and it was one of our employees. So that happens. Anyway, so the two components are deploy the malware, get ready to activate it, get the sensitive data, and grab a hold of it. And this is what you see in the news, right? In the news, what you hear is, oh, this cyber attacker is threatening to release all this sensitive data. That is their typical mode of attack. All right. All right. So the way the attackers communicate with systems outside the organization is this idea of C2 callbacks, and when they are embedded, it looks like normal web traffic, unless you have sophisticated enough tools to identify it. It's almost invisible. It is almost invisible. And so organizations should have very strong web filtering tools that are able to pull apart data streams. Remember what I was telling you in foundations, that networking and addressing, right, has these packets that tell it where it's going. Well, a well-designed web filter will pull that header apart and see where it's going, and should have a reference list of whether or not that's a malicious area or not. So that's essentially how this works. It's basically what I just said in the last slide. All right. Command and control. Victim requires ransomware. The ransomware contacts the outside, and then data is encrypted, and then users are sent this email that basically says, we got your data and we've encrypted all your machines. If you want to get your data unencrypted, you're going to have to pay a certain amount of money. Now, I have seen this in action in an organization where a person was not paying attention to the links that they were clicking on. And thankfully, we were protected in general, but this person clicked on a link, downloaded some malware, and they were an artist, and they had a bunch of proprietary art on their laptop. Now, the interesting thing is, if they had used our backup services, they would have been protected, but they chose not to do that because they had they were mistrustful of IT, is the best I can say about that. And then what ended up happening was the malware encrypted the machine, and it's command and control. The malicious threat actor has control of the machine and can send you messages, and the message was sent. Pay us $780, we'll unencrypt your machine. So that tells you two things. Number one, it doesn't matter how small, right? All it matters is, and the second thing is that they can make money off of it. So we told him, you can pay the money. We can't tell you to do it or not to do it. But we told him two things. One, if you pay the money and you get an encryption key, you better get the data off your machine as soon as humanly possible. Otherwise, they'll just re-encrypt it. And the second thing we told him is, you can't plug your machine anywhere in the network at work. So he tried to do that, so we confiscated the machine. He paid the ransomware, then decided that the threat actors were all good, and he never unencrypted, or he unencrypted it, but he never downloaded his data, and they encrypted it again about a week later. Anyway, not a happy ending. All right. The encryption process is the most devastating part of the cyber attack lifecycle, because once it's encrypted, those systems cannot be used. The attacker has control of them, and so in all of our tabletop exercises, what we do is we mimic what would happen is if somebody had taken control of critical systems within our environment, and how would we respond to that. So one thing I like about my notes on this slide is, once you've been encrypted, this is not a technology issue anymore. This is a leadership issue, and decisions will have to be made about what do we do about payment, non-payment, how do we recover systems, etc. So there are regulatory reporting issues, there are governance issues, there are insurance issues, and then there are legal issues. And within the NIST framework, this maps to the respond and recover phase. Once you've been encrypted, you don't have a choice. You have to respond to it, and you're going to have to find a way to recover it, which includes, right, response planning ahead of time, executive readiness, understanding what sort of crisis communication is going to happen, and how resilient is the organization if this were to happen. Now, I will tell you that most organizations struggle to recover from cyber attacks. I think a lot of people think they can overcome it, but it's easier said than done. I can't stress strongly enough how important the ounce of prevention is to keep bad things from happening. And it's not about just having antivirus software. It's not just about having a firewall. It is a comprehensive program that deals with every phase of this process, like I just told you, because this stuff can crop up anywhere. One thing I appreciate about my operations team is we respond to events, what we call events. We use the CIS structure, which I think is in one of the other decks, and it's a 1 through 5 structure. So we deal with events, what we call 1s and 2s, every day. There's not a day that goes by. This is somebody has forwarded organizational email to a private email address, which is a violation of policy, right? Because we can control the security on our machines, but we can't control it on somebody else's machine. And so we have policies against that. And we have ways to know if they're doing it. We have multi-factor authentication, but we limit the multi-factor authentication as much as humanly possible so that it can't be compromised. And by the way, people still get MFA fatigue. We get hammered constantly by leaked usernames and passwords. But because the threat actors don't have the multi-factor authentication, they don't have a means to bypass the security apparatus, but they have learned a way. Keep calling, keep sending the number, keep sending the notification. Think about it from a duo perspective. Keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. This is what's called MFA fatigue. Eventually, somebody looks at their phone and goes, I don't think that's me, but boom, let them in. And as soon as they let them in, the threat actor now has control of their account. And that does happen. It happens more frequently than we would like. All right, so that's the anatomy of a cyber attack. People come in through misconfigurations, CVEs, or phishing, or some kind of what we would call social engineering, right? They gain a foothold, look at ways to escalate their privileges. They do reconnaissance. They map out the network and the resources. They see who has control of what. They quietly deploy malware around the network. And then ultimately, when they're ready to get paid, they activate the network after they exfiltrate the data that they want to sell back to the organization. And that's how cyber attacks work. They are everywhere. If I were to tell you how many times our external addresses get scanned a day, it's in the tens of thousands. It's insane. And we respond to all kinds of stuff. And I'm going to show you some log data that we use at UAB Medicine in a filter form. So, all right, that is the anatomy of a cyber attack. Thank you.